Women's political leadership, for the most part a 20th century phenomenon, began with the battle for recognition, with a cry for the right to be heard. Political pioneers led the way, from the streets to the voting booths, from the sidelines to center stage. Many would realize their dreams, and some would change our world. As we stand poised to face the political challenges of the new millennium, a look back at the remarkable women political leaders of the 20th century shows just how far we have come. At the dawn of the 20th century, two powerful women rulers stood out for their stature and for their passing. Su Tsai, the Dowager Empress of China, had ruled on and off from 1861 to 1908. Occasionally yielding the throne to various male heirs, the Empress was quick to resume power and assert her own political will. She adamantly resisted foreign influence in China, going so far as to encourage the two-year Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which would ultimately cause the demise of her rule and dynasty. Su Tsai was the last empress to directly rule China, and her successor, Pu Yi, the last emperor, would only be a figurehead. In the West, the vast British Empire had been very successfully governed by Queen Victoria since her succession to the throne in 1837.
Queen Victoria's reign, of course, was a very long reign. It was more than 63 years, from 1837 to 1901. And by the time that she died, of course, she'd been on the throne for really 2 generations at least. And so she'd really outlived quite a lot of people. And she symbolized 19th century Britain. It's not surprising that an entire era, almost a century, is named after her, Victorian Britain. She symbolized conservatism, she symbolized the solidity and the importance of the nation, and she solidified, I think, and symbolized family values in a very important way. So when she died, I think it was fitting in a sense that the new century began as Victoria ended. And so I think the symbolism is both about what her reign stood for and therefore what the 20th century could be with the Victorian era and Queen Victoria herself out of the way.
At the time of Victoria's death, most women throughout the world were still subject to a male-dominated patriarchal society. Like most professions of the day, turn-of-the-century politics was a man's job. A woman's place was in the home, conveniently removed from the political process. In fact, New Zealand was the only country where women could vote on a national level.
New Zealand was a pioneer society, and the women were out there working pretty hard in a pioneer environment. So I think that made women more assertive about their place in society. Actually, the women who promoted it weren't really seeking even for women to come into Parliament. What they wanted was for women to have a say, to have the vote, but their aspirations were quite modest, and of course it took a long time, right up until the 1930s, for the first woman MP to come in, and then they were very few and far between for a long time.
Although women's political needs differed from country to country, many came to see the necessity of political participation. However, the disenfranchisement of women made it impractical for women to participate, let alone run for office. Yet this would soon change as the right to vote became the foremost issue on the women's rights agenda. In Great Britain, the suffrage movement was in full swing at the turn of the century. The militant Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, resorted to unusually aggressive methods of persuasion, sending shockwaves throughout the nation. Meanwhile, in the U.S., a new generation of suffragists, led by Harriet Stanton Blatch, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt, picked up where pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony left off.
All three are distinguished from earlier generations by being very clever politically. And I mean that really with respect to, quote, men's politics. They understand that legislators, politicians, voters, referendum, they're all crucial to getting votes for women. And they're not afraid of that arena, and they work very cleverly. They're all politicians in one way or another, even though in 1910 the notion of a woman politician is a sort of oxymoron, but the truth is they all are. Now they're different. Blatch is a lot like her mother. She's really the one who recognizes the significance of bringing working women in large numbers into the suffrage movement, and this is a great achievement on her part. Alice Paul is much more focused on suffrage and only suffrage, but she's very daring tactically, and she is willing to take women into the streets. She's willing to take women into civil disobedience, and she has incredible personal focus and charisma. She's quite young, and people really basically are willing to follow her anywhere. Carrie Catt is usually credited with the ultimate winning of the vote, and she was a master politician. She could handle the two kinds of politics that needed to be handled. She could handle the legislative politics, but she could also handle the politics within the women's movement, which were pretty complex. And she kept all these different factions, old and young, upper class and working class, rural and urban. She kept them all together in a massive coalition, which was able to finally bring votes for women to a victorious conclusion.
In 1913, Jeanette Rankin was appointed Field Secretary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in Montana. The next year, Montana granted women the right to vote, opening the door for Rankin to run for Congress in 1916. Even while many other women in the U.S. remained disenfranchised, and though she was a Republican in a Democratic state, Jeanette Rankin won her seat in the House, making her the first woman to serve in Congress.
One of the first important things that she faced was the question of a declaration of war. This was in the old days when wars were declared by Congress. And Jeanette Rankin, not alone, among others, votes against going to war.
Rankin would lose her seat in the next election due to her unwavering stance against World War I. Soon after the United States entered the war, a beleaguered Russian government fell into the hands of Vladimir Lenin and his Red Army. In an unprecedented move, Lenin's communist regime set out to establish a greater degree of sexual parity by granting women instant access to political participation. Women were then appointed to government positions maintained by a system of quotas. One of the most accomplished women was Alexandra Mikhailovna. This fervent Soviet political leader, diplomat, and writer was appointed the first Soviet Commissar of Public Welfare in 1917, and in 1943 she became the world's first woman ambassador. Perhaps the most notorious communist revolutionary of the time was a German woman named Rosa Luxemburg. She helped lead the German Communist Party until she was arrested and murdered by German troops. The German government then used Rosa's murder as an example to other would-be communist revolutionaries. When World War I finally ended in 1918, many nations came to recognize the patriotic contributions made by so many women during their nation's time of crisis. As a result, England's Parliament passed the Conciliation Bill, granting the right to vote to married women as well as non-working class women over the age of 30. This paved the way for Lady Nancy Astor, an ardent feminist and British socialite, to become the first woman elected to Parliament in 1919. She would serve 26 years in the House of Commons and will always be known for her strong feminist views and undaunted personality evident in her many clever quips. "We are not asking for superiority," she once said, "for we already have that. All we ask is equality." Canada was quick to follow and elected its first woman Member of Parliament in 1922. Agnes MacPhail served 5 terms in federal parliament and played a major role in passing the social legislation of her time. She also served as a delegate to the League of Nations and fought hard for women's rights, especially on issues of equal pay and divorce. The tide had definitely turned for women seeking civil recognition and civil rights. By the 1920s, the majority of democracies had granted women the vote. In the United States, victorious suffragettes enthusiastically campaigned for upcoming elections and set their sights on future political goals. In 1921, Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution, an amendment guaranteeing equal rights under the law not to be denied on account of sex. In the next few years, however, women would not turn out to vote in the numbers expected. The number of women seeking office also dropped, and after the elections of 1924, the women's political movement in America slowed to a virtual halt. Meanwhile, the age of the flapper had roared into existence, and women's politics would have to take a back seat. Yet the free-spirited days would not last. By 1930, much of the world was mired in depression, and when the Hoover administration failed to take significant action, America was ready for a New Deal. The New Deal meant jobs and relief, courtesy of newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor.
I think Eleanor Roosevelt is perhaps best known to us as a great humanitarian rather than as a great politician, which she actually was.
We'll win out. We'll win out not because of a government, not even because of our leaders.
She was herself a driving force within the New Deal social policy. She was the only First Lady, really, I think, including Hillary Clinton, who comes in with political networks and constituencies of her own that are separate and apart from her husband's. She had always been active in the women's movement. She had been active in the social settlement movement. She had been active in women's labor unions, and she brought all of that with her to the White House and continued to advocate for their causes.
President Roosevelt made history when he appointed Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor, the first woman cabinet member in U.S. history. A friend of Eleanor's, as well as a staunch political ally for FDR, Perkins was sworn in on March 4, 1933. She played a significant role in shaping public policy through the Depression and was instrumental in creating much of Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. As the 1930s progressed, the rise of political extremism ultimately led to another world conflict. By 1940, the politics of depression were replaced by the politics of war. Women were desperately needed to aid in the war effort. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's goodwill tours now included trips to the war front to boost morale. Claire Booth Luce, the newly elected Republican Congresswoman from Connecticut, also toured the war front to rally support. As an accomplished writer and editor, Luce proved to have a flair for diplomacy, and in 1952 was appointed ambassador to Italy by President Eisenhower. She was the first American woman to be named a chief diplomatic representative to a major foreign power. As World War II raged on, China not only fought the onslaught of the Japanese, but also fought a bitter civil war. Communists against nationalists. During this time, three sisters emerged as dominant political figures who helped to shape China's destiny for nearly a century. The Sung sisters, A Ling, Qing Ling, and Mei Ling, are remembered by a famous Chinese saying, "Once upon a time there were three sisters. One loved money, one loved power, one loved China." A Ling was well known as personal secretary to Sun Yat-sen, and later she would be famous for her financial cunning. Qing Ling was married to the legendary Sun Yat-sen, who died in 1925 after founding the Chinese Republic in 1911. Mei Ling became one of the most powerful women of the 20th century when she married Chiang Kai-shek, head of the Chinese Nationalist Party, an internationally recognized ruler of China. Madame Chiang spent 3 decades influencing Sino-American policy to her own ends. She was generally recognized as the real power behind Chiang Kai-shek and China itself.
Arriving at Washington, the capital of the United States, Madame Chiang is greeted by Mrs. Roosevelt.
When Chiang Kai-shek needed more money to fund his war campaign, he sent his wife, Madame Chiang, to America to speak directly to the President and Congress.
It is my great pleasure, my high privilege, and my distinguished honor to present to you Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
On one occasion, Madame Chiang addressed Congress, criticizing U.S. war policy, which focused the majority of U.S. resources in Europe rather than the Pacific. With the help of Clare Boothe Luce and the China lobby, Mei Ling went home with a $1 billion check. Nonetheless, by 1950, Chiang Kai-shek had lost the war to Mao Zedong and his Communist Army. Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang fled to Formosa, where they maintained their nationalist government, if only in name. Qing Ling, former wife of Sun Yat-sen, remained in China and became the vice chairman of the People's Republic of China, second in command to Mao Zedong. For post-war England, the symbol of the new era arrived in 1952 with the coronation of a new queen, Elizabeth II.
She, of course, comes to the throne not long after the end of the war, at that point where Britain seems to be getting back on its feet. And so she can symbolize, and does symbolize, I think, for both politicians and the public, this new era of prosperity and peace and stability.
In the same year, Argentina lost its beloved Eva Peron. Eva was the wife of Juan Perón, the populist president of Argentina, who came to power amid the political shakeup of the post-war era. Eva, often called Evita, became the object of intense, almost mystical adoration by the country's common people. She gained international attention during a rainbow tour of Europe, designed to promote Argentina's interests. At home, she was instrumental in the formation of the Peronist Women's Party, as well as the Eva Peron Foundation for Charitable Works for the nation's poor. The people of Argentina, in turn, clamored for Eva to officially assume political office, and despite growing dissent from military and political opponents, she was nominated as a vice presidential candidate. It was, however, a goal Eva would never realize, as she was subsequently diagnosed with terminal cancer. Renouncing her political aspirations, Eva Peron fell into a steep and sudden decline, and on July 26, 1952, at the age of 33, she passed away. The overwhelming outpouring of grief that followed her death brought close to 1 million mourners to the streets of Buenos Aires for her funeral procession. Elsewhere in the world, women would continue to achieve notable breakthroughs and accomplishments in national leadership. In Sri Lanka, Shiramavu Bandaranaike would become the first woman leader in the world when her husband was assassinated by a Buddhist monk. Elected in her own right in 1960, she firmly held on to power until 1964 when she lost the general election. Mrs. Bandaranaike was voted back into office again in 1970, remaining in office for another 7 years. During the 70s, Mrs. Bandaranaike's politics moved left as she declared the country a republic and officially changed its name from Ceylon to Sri Lanka. She also nationalized certain companies for the first time in her nation's history. This move to the left was due in part to her strong personal friendship with the first woman prime minister of nearby India, Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Nehru, India's first prime minister.
She devoted her time principally to look after her father and all his affairs. This naturally brought her into the full play of the political arena, and being a member of that family and a part of the Indian freedom movement, she could not help but absorb the experiences of those great times.
Indira Gandhi officially came to power in 1966. She was elected to 2 more 5-year terms in 1971 and then again in 1980.
She always had a very strong attachment for the poor people, the tribals, the disadvantaged sections. In fact, they were the most vigorous supporters and members of her constituency.
However, her 3rd term came to an abrupt end on October 31st, 1984, when Mrs. Gandhi was shot to death by a member of her own security. 3 years after Indira Gandhi first became Prime Minister, the country of Israel elected Golda Meir as their first woman Prime Minister. Golda Meir was born in America and immigrated to Israel in 1921. Meir was one of the original signers of Israel's Independence Proclamation in 1948 and became Israel's first minister to the USSR that same year. In 1949, she won an election for a seat in the first Israeli parliament, and exactly 20 years later became the Prime Minister of Israel.
Golda Meir developed a tremendous reputation. She was a plain-speaking, chain-smoking, strong woman. Ben-Gurion once said, David Ben-Gurion, who was the founder of Israel, once said, the only man in my cabinet in the sense of tough, strong person happens to be a woman.
Meir remained in power until 1974, when she resigned amid controversy over Israel's lack of preparedness in the Yom Kippur War. Golda Meir died 4 years later in Jerusalem, the city that she loved and spent the majority of her life fighting for. The late 60s and early 70s hosted a worldwide resurgence of women's issues. In America, the feminist movement, also known as the Women's Liberation Movement, concentrated efforts on political solutions to social reform. As a result, the number of politically active women skyrocketed, ushering in a new wave of women politicians. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman elected to Congress. Chisholm had served in the New York State Legislature from 1964 until 1968, when she was elected to represent the 12th District of New York in the House of Representatives.
Well, when I get to Congress, you know, I am going to be one of 435 freshmen. And it is often said that freshmen should be seen and not heard. But I intend to immediately focus my voice dramatically on many of the issues that confront the black people all over America.
Certainly one of the people who, in the African-American female community, who was part and parcel and product of both the civil rights movement and the women's movement was Shirley Chisholm. She wanted to make a statement about the involvement of women in general, and particularly of black women, on a national political scene.
Chisholm campaigned for, but did not win the 1972 Democratic presidential nomination. Her desire was to give the voters another choice besides the usual slate of white males.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America. I am not the candidate of black America, although I am black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that.
Meanwhile, Jiang Qing of China was climbing the political rungs of the Communist Party. The third wife of communist leader Mao Zedong, she became the Minister of Culture in 1960, allowing her to play a key role in China's cultural revolution of the late 1960s. Following Mao's death in 1976, Jiang sought to further her political stature. As a leading member of the prominent Gang of Four, Jiang and the others tried to seize power. The coup failed. The four were arrested and later convicted of treason in 1980. She received a death sentence in 1981, which was later commuted to life in prison. Jiang Qing ended her own life, hanging herself in her prison cell in May of 1991. In South America, 1974 saw the passing of Argentine President Juan Perón. Days after his death, representatives from 20 political parties met in Buenos Aires and made history by announcing the first woman president in the world. Maria Estela Isabel Martinez de Perón was the second wife of Juan Perón, and like other early 20th century female leaders, her power and prominence grew from her marriage. In 1973, she became the vice president of the Republic of Argentina before replacing her husband as president. However, her time in power was short-lived, and she was ousted in a military coup in 1976. After serving 5 years under house arrest, Maria Perón was put on parole and moved to Madrid, Spain. On the African continent, several queens or queen regents ruled various regions during the 20th century. But in the 1970s, Africa brought to power its first female prime minister and the first black woman ruler of an independent state. In 1975, Elizabeth Dometien was appointed by dictator Jean Bedel Bokassa to govern the Central African Republic. When she later spoke out against Bokassa's desire to establish a monarchy, Dometien was removed from her post in 1976 and briefly imprisoned. Though she would be kept from continuing her career in politics, she would remain a successful international businesswoman.
Do you remember what Queen Victoria once said? Failure? The possibilities do not exist.
In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first woman in Great Britain to hold the office of Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher is the consummate politician, and she didn't really see herself as elected because she was a woman, or indeed in spite of being a woman. She saw herself as a politician, as a conservative with a very specific and really very radical conservative agenda. One of the first things that Margaret Thatcher did, of course, was to denationalise a whole series of state-owned or publicly owned industries. This was one of the cornerstones of her economic policy, and she did so in the name of free trade. These kinds of policies were very radical. They were very different from what other conservatives had done in Britain prior to this time, prior to the 1880s. I mean, she really was taking Britain back to a classic economic notion of what we would call laissez-faire or free trade liberalism.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Margaret Thatcher steadily rose through the ranks, starting in 1959 when she was elected to the House of Commons. Vowing to reverse Britain's economic decline and to reduce the role of government, Thatcher won the will of the people. Bolstered by the success of her Falkland Islands campaign, Thatcher led the Conservatives to a sweeping victory in the parliamentary elections of June 1983. Victorious in the June 1987 elections, she became the first British Prime Minister in the 20th century to serve 3 consecutive terms. In 1990, controversy over her tax policy and over her reluctance to commit Great Britain to full economic integration with Europe inspired a strong challenge to her leadership. She therefore resigned, having held office longer than any British Prime Minister in the 20th century. Not too far off the coast of England, another 3-term administration was in the making. Like Margaret Thatcher, Vigdis Finnbogadottir of Iceland was elected as her country's first woman head of state and served as the president from 1980 to 1992.
I do so swear.
In 1981, Sandra Day OConnor became the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court. Nominated by President Ronald Reagan, O'Connor was promoted from the Arizona Court of Appeals and was quickly confirmed by the U.S. Senate in September of 1981. Her moderate views have come to define her role as the centrist coalition builder, which consequently has enhanced her image and influence. Another milestone was achieved in 1984 with the vice presidential nomination of GeraldineFerraro.
By choosing a woman to run for our nation's second highest office, you send a powerful signal to all Americans. There are no doors we cannot unlock.
America moved a step closer to putting a woman in the White House when the New York Congresswoman was chosen by Democratic presidential nominee Walter Mondale. In the late 80s and through the early 90s, a growing number of women in Asia took center stage on the political scene. In 1986, Corazon Aquino, the widow of slain opposition leader Benigno Aquino, became president of the Philippines, beating out longtime ruler Ferdinand Marcos at the polls.
We are finally free.
This politically inexperienced homemaker and mother of 5 took the reins at a time of great instability. Overcoming numerous attempts to oust her from power, Corazon Aquino ruled with resolve until 1992. Burma at this time was also a hotbed of instability. On a crusade to bring democracy to her embroiled country, Aung San Suu Kyi, General Secretary of the National League for Democracy, led demonstrations against the 26-year-old one-party socialist government. In the summer of '88, the movement was crushed by the military, and several thousand people were killed. 2 years later, elections were held, and Aung San Suu Kyi, as the head of the NLD party, won in a landslide. The military government refused to recognize the election results and put Aung San Suu Kyi and the rest of the elected government leaders under house arrest. But San Suu Kyi still found a way to reach her supporters and keep the movement alive by means of her weekend talks.
I've always thought of our meetings as happy ones, basically. They are very disciplined and they're very cheerful. And I think they come because for them it's a taste of democracy. At least they can put their questions to me freely, the sort of questions they've been wanting to ask for a long time, but they have never dared to ask, or the kind of comments that they would like to have made a long time ago but have not been able to make.
In 1991, Aung San Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to restore democracy in Burma, but was unable to attend the ceremony in Switzerland. Finally, in 1995, she was released from house arrest, yet her freedom is still restricted to this day. Nevertheless, San Suu Kyi continues her fight, believing that her efforts will one day help restore democracy in Burma. In nearby Pakistan, 1988 was the year Benazir Bhutto became the first woman in the world to head the government of an Islamic state. Prime Minister Bhutto's time in power was often stormy, but she always remained dedicated and focused on her duty to her country. She pledged to transform Pakistani society by focusing attention on programs for health, social welfare, and education for the underprivileged. In 1996, Ms. Bhutto came under pressure from the press and public, who charged her government with corruption and mismanagement. On November 5, 1996, President of Pakistan, Farooq Laghari, dismissed Prime Minister Bhutto and dissolved the National Assembly. She did run again in the national elections of 1997, but was soundly defeated. Elsewhere in the world, 1990 was the year Mary Robinson was elected as the new President of Ireland.
I must be President for all the people.
As Ireland's head of state, Miss Robinson represented her country internationally, developing a new sense of Ireland's economic, political, and cultural links with other countries and cultures.
I think President Robinson's election, characterized or epitomized the changes that had been happening in Irish society, and the fact that, the old stereotypes and the old molds had been broken.
As president, Mary Robinson had a very impressive record on human rights, which led to her 1997 appointment as the new United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. 1990 was also the year Violeta Barrios de Chamorro became president of Nicaragua in an upset victory over Sandinista strongman Daniel Ortega. She began her rise to power in 1979 when she briefly joined the ruling Sandinista junta following the 1979 revolution. Disillusioned, she resigned and converted the Chamorro family newspaper, La Prensa, into a tool of opposition. When Ortega agreed to free elections in 1990, Chamorro was swept into office, becoming the first woman to govern a Central American nation. In office, she instituted a program of national reconciliation, brought an end to the U.S.-backed Contra War, and ended Sandinista control of the military. In the African state of Burundi, Sylvie Kaniki rose to power at a very critical period of political reform. When the elected president Melchior Ndadaye and other senior cabinet members were killed by Tutsi military rebels, Kaniki, a moderate member of the Tutsi-based National Party, survived by hiding out in the French embassy. During 6 chaotic days, she managed to terminate the crisis and restore order to her state. She successfully gained control of the government by gaining support from international powers and the loyalty of most of the army, which distanced itself from the junta. Kaniki continued acting as president until the installation of President Intarria Mira on February 5, 1994. In 1997, Ireland witnessed a woman-to-woman transition when Mary McLeast replaced Mary Robinson as president. At her inauguration, Mary McLeast pledged to work for a millennium gift of peace in the divided island, stating that she would do all she could to help peacemakers who are seeking a lasting resolution to the North Ireland conflict. We hope and pray, indeed we insist, that we have seen the last of violence. McLeese, a devout Roman Catholic and nationalist, is the first president from the British-ruled province of Northern Ireland.
Am I proud that I got a chance to appoint the first woman Secretary of State? You bet I am. My mama's smiling down at me right now.
That same year, Madeleine Albright became the highest-ranking woman in the United States government. Appointed by President Clinton, Albright was sworn in as the first woman Secretary of State. As a leader in international relations, she has helped change the course of history, and in so doing, has also set a new standard for women around the world. November 20th, 1998 marked a sad day in Russian politics. One of Russia's brightest advocates for human rights and reform was brutally gunned down. Galina Starovoytova was a prominent figure of the democratic opposition to communism and served as a member of the Congress of the People's Deputies for the Russian Federation. Galina was also an advisor to President Boris Yeltsin and was the only woman nominated for the Russian presidency in the 1996 election. Her murder begs not only the question of who did it, but why. Without a doubt, 1999 was a groundbreaking year in women's politics. Helen Clark became the second consecutive woman Prime Minister of New Zealand, winning over Jenny Shipley, who assumed the position of Prime Minister in 1997.
The incoming government and all New Zealanders can be absolutely assured of our total cooperation in this transition period. We love this country far too much to have anything happen that will do anything to damage its international or domestic reputation.
What I'm driving at is seeing New Zealand develop in the 21st century as a tolerant, interesting, well-informed, well-educated, upmarket society. It's going to be very culturally diverse, far more than it is even today. But the objective is to have everyone in this society with a decent standard of living, hope for their kids, a clean environment, a lively cultural and artistic life, and just an interesting place to be.
Maria Elisa Moscoso de Arias became the first woman president of Panama when she was sworn into office on September 1st, 1999, and will remain in office until 2004. She won the election with 44.9% of the vote, defeating Martin Torrijos, the son of late strongman Omar Torrijos. Her conservative approach during her campaign has promised a government more sensitive with the needy. In December of '99, Moscoso presided over the Panama Canal handover, which gave Panama complete control of the canal and the areas surrounding it. Meanwhile, Megawati Sukanawati was poised to reclaim the presidency of Indonesia in the country's first free election in 4 decades. 3 decades after the overthrow of her father in a bloody coup, Megawati had her revenge, helping bring down Indonesia's seemingly invincible strongman. After winning the popular vote, Megawati's election as president did not stand. It was said that many lawmakers, some of them members of the important Muslim parties, were unwilling to give their backing to a woman for president. The failure to confirm Megawati as president sparked violent protests. To placate Megawati and her supporters, the Assembly elected her as vice president on October 21, 1999. As the century came to a close, the United States garnered the world's attention with Election 2000. Aside from the controversial presidential race, it was a record-breaking election for women. 66 women were elected to the U.S. Congress, bringing the total number of women senators to 13, and the number of representatives to 59. The most publicized congressional race took place in New York, where First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton defeated Congressman Rick Lazio for a seat in the U.S. Senate.
Thank you for opening up your minds and your hearts, for seeing the possibility of what we could do together for our children and for our future here in this state and in our nation. I am profoundly grateful to all of you for giving me the chance to serve you.
We're making steady progress, so it's very encouraging. It's still tough, though, and it'll be many, many years, I believe, before we get to anything near half of the Congress. And primarily it's because of the money that it costs to run. And until we square that away, women are going to have a very tough time.
For all of women's remarkable political achievements in the past century, there is still political ground to cover in many places in the world. In the year 2000, only 9 of the 190 heads of state in the world were women, and only 13.8% of parliamentary seats around the world were occupied by women. But looking back at the political strides women have achieved since the early days of the suffrage movement, one may wonder whether we have witnessed what can be described as the century of the woman, or whether that century has only just begun.